The horror of Ballahoo Manor. The mainland has always owned the most powerful networks on their own railway. But it wasn't the only one. The Fat Controller's Railway had that sort of powerful network too. But the Fat Controller had sometimes used to have the most powerful networks on his railway, until one day everything changed. He had something he had planned in mind to make another, which would lead to some old tracks. But there was a lot of different tracks to choose from. The first one was at an old siding, and two were a double track, and a switch with it to the mainland, which means everybody had always known that since ever. Until some day later, the Fat Controller came to see Dennis and Frank at the sheds. "I have an important job for the two of you," he said. You two are to go to the far side of Ballahoo and make the overgrown siding as good as new, so that the manor itself will be as good as new, so that visitors can have tea and crumpets there. "Yes, sir," said the two Diesels. They were very excited. "But," he said, "you two are to take it in turns each day," he said, "which I know you two know what I mean." "Yes, sir," said both Dennis and Frank. With that, the Fat Controller walked away, knowing that his plan was ready. Until at last, Frank arrived at the yards. He had found his goods train. He even buffered up to the goods train. An empty flatbed truck was supposed to have building material, but instead it was hidden in a box car, and some workmen were in a works coach. Frank didn't mind what he had to do. With that, he had already listened carefully to instructions and pushed away. Frank was still humming along the line. When he went through the station, he saw something which he never saw before. Through the siding was an old manor, and all over it was some overgrown trees and bushes. Soon Frank galloped, and he was still in shock when he had that sinking feeling in his boiler that this manor would be haunted. "Come on, Frank," said his driver. "Are you scared or what?" "No, not at all," said Frank, and he puffed on into the siding. And next to the manor, where he was waiting at a set of buffers. And a few moments later, the workmen were still working on the manor, and they were still cutting down the branches. But in the evening they were finished, and it was time to go. Frank's driver was about to back Frank down for the journey home when they heard the sound of a massive gunshot, followed by a scream. "Ah!" The workmen, leaning out of the works coach, came to see what the noise was, and then, walking out of the manor, was a woman in a dark cloak with a pistol gun. Frank's driver and fireman were in shock, and so was Frank. "What was that?" Frank's driver asked his fireman. "I'm not sure," said said the fireman, and before they could go out and see, Frank had to back away. "Get me out! Get me out!" he cried, and then they were out of the siding and went through the station. Even the driver and fireman had to call the police, and Frank was even more scared now. The next morning, Frank's driver and fireman had a visit with both the fat controller and the police. They started answering and asking questions about the incident last night. We saw a woman in a dark cloak," said the fireman, "and she looks like she was after something." "Did you try to stop her before she could get away?" asked the police officer. "No," said the fireman. "We didn't. We were too late." With that, the police were ready to leave. "We're doing the best we can to capture those criminals. For the time being, you and your engine have to do your work." And they drove away. The fat controller spoke severely to Frank's driver and fireman. "Whoever has caused this disturbance is not doing as they are told," he said, "and I can't have engines that won't obey my orders. You will work in the yards until we get to the bottom of this." And he walked out. But until a few days later, there were rumours everywhere, as all of it became a joke to Dennis. "Anyone would think," laughed Dennis, "that Frank was contacting the dead." "Shut up," snaps Murdoch. "It's not funny. Frank is your friend, not your rival." Then it made Dennis laugh. "Oh, really?" he laughed. "He may be my friend, but I'm teasing him about it." Then he looked at Murdoch with disbelief. "First this nonsense about old Dean Morris, and now this," he said. "This is all too much of a joke." Murdoch completely ignored Dennis, but Dennis still laughed. But in the meantime, there was more to come, which Dennis had never witnessed before. But until a few weeks later, Madge had to take some workmen to the manor. She arrived just in time as the workmen were getting inside the manor. But by the time they were in, they all ran out. Madge saw the manor and galloped after the workmen got back inside her. And soon, Madge roared in to tell Frank the news. "You were right about one thing," she said. "That manor does look haunted." "Indeed," said Frank. "I better warn Dennis now before it's too late." But unfortunately, Frank didn't get the chance to. Dennis was too busy taking some building material and some workmen to the manor. He was on his way. He began feeling very bored. "If we don't finish this quickly," he said, "Frank will take my favourite place at the sheds." "Have patience," said his driver. We'll be done soon, and that will be the end of it." But Frank didn't believe his driver and fireman at all. And it was getting late by the time the workmen were working slow on the manor. Soon Dennis began to grow impatient, and he was not happy with it. Until that night, the workmen were finished. Soon Dennis was about to head home when he saw another ear-piercing scream, followed by a gunshot. Then the workmen and Dennis's driver and fireman went out and came to see what that noise was. What was that? Dennis's driver and fireman asked. There was a long pause. And then, coming out of the darkness, was a soldier carrying a rifle. The driver and fireman and workmen ran. "Wait," said Dennis. "Don't leave me behind." But no one heard him. The soldier stepped towards Dennis coldly at him as he was preparing for his rifle. "No," cried Dennis and shut his eyes. But by the time he opened his eyes, the soldier had gone. And then Dennis, closing his eyes and drifting off to sleep, still hoped that this was all a bad dream. At last morning came, and Stepney had just been coupled up to pull Frank out of the side, to pull Dennis out of the siding, and then into the station. But when Dennis came back to his shed, he told Frank he was sorry, and together both the two Diesels were shaken by this event. Duke soon began a story of how it happened. Ballahoo Manor, he said, was once a place belonging to a rich man and woman. He continued. Ballahoo Manor was still a big house owned by a destined company who wanted to make soldiers from the World War feel better after their injuries. But until some day later, Duke continued with his story. A nurse refused to mend the soldier's wounds, and then the soldier shot the nurse, and before anyone could see him, the soldier shot himself. But by the time they were nowhere to be seen, a foreign engine puffed in to see what the noise was and found their dead bodies. And it had said, continued Duke, that on this day on, said Duke when he finished his story, that the nurse has always ran away from his victim, and the soldier always comes out of that manor searching for his victim. That is why the manor has always been haunted, said Duke after he finished his story. Soon the two Diesels were shaken by this story and events, and hoping that they would not come back there. The Fat Controller overheard Duke's story and thoughtfully walked away to arrange what he shouldn't have planned. And until a few months later, the arrangement to rebuild Ballahoo Manor had been called off. But as for Dennis and Frank, they all hoped that the ghostly figures will disappear as well as the manor itself.